Hello everyone, today we talk about, very briefly, movement in Napoleonic warfare. As you know, I made a series reading and commenting von Clausewitz vom Kriege, in which we analyze thoroughly through the Prussian general's analysis how an army of the Napoleonic era moved, how especially the strategic implications of the army supplies, because there is a misconception that somehow spread in the more in tune with our today's cultural abomination, like the deterministic and relativistic and frankly completely ignorant concept that war is fundamentally about logistics in of itself, and that logistics is somehow more important than strategy as such. Logistics, it doesn't even have a proper part in the art of war, right? The art of war considers how logistics is used in function of strategy, which is a completely different concept, right? That I can exemplify in other ways. Like logistics can be just architecture. Like it's a civilian branch, right? A civilian without any strategic education can build a trench, maybe even perfectly so from a technical point of view, but having not the palest idea where to locate it in function of the armed forces that are going to operate with it for the ultimate sake of the strategic goal, right? At least he will have built some trenches maybe on the basis of some tactical notions that will be handed to him in a sort of standardized way, but it's a completely different thing. The way you think of supplying strategically has to do where, for example, to make your army cross, or how to scatter it during the billeting, etc., in order to facilitate the supply and so on. It has nothing to do with logistics per se, because just like with the army, right, the theory of the art of war has to do with the army just given per se, and so the logistical capacity is given per se, which doesn't mean, of course, that you're going always to have a perfect army or perfect logistical system, but that's exactly why strategy is thought in a way that doesn't tell you how to move a cart or to build one, but where to find the actual stuff and the means that can make you afford to supply your army effectively. Now, this point is particularly important for today's video because the reason why Napoleonic armies were so speedy, so fast, lays exactly in the radically different logistical needs that such armies had compared just to the ones of a few decades before. Right? It has to do with the massive increase in size of these armies. This is something we've already seen in other videos. I don't remember whether I already made a brief survey of this for Napoleonic warfare already, but we will keep talking about it also as far as modern warfare, contemporary warfare also is concerned. But as the most perceptive of you have surely already realized, the revolution in France triggered quite some political and social factors that had a very specific military consequence. That is to say, given that now all people were equal, right, which was not entirely so, at least their rights weren't, not even in the peak of the revolution for that matter. And it's not a negative thing in that regard, because that's how it still is to a degree today. I mean, aside from the utopia of equality that, of course, can never be achieved by total definition, the various forces involved within this world are substantially different. As, for example, the very high quality of the French professional military that had remained from monarchic times into the revolutionary ones showed in front of the much more, cheaply trained conscripts, but the latter played also a huge role, quantitatively speaking, because now with this extension, right, of some rights at least and duties mostly, let's say the levy, right, of the French population, and also one of the countries that, by the way, adopted the Jacobin constitution and basis and so on. It's a base of the nation state, right? Institutionally and juridically. Made multiple videos on this. This is not the time to digress on, nor about the differences between civil and common law, because at the end of the day, civilization works pretty similarly, right, in the way power has to extend. In fact, revolutionary and Napoleonic armies are the proof of that, right there. Here I have, as an amateur, the aforementioned Karl Philipp Gottlieb von Clausewitz, who embodies, like in the German, in the Sonderweg, we can say the adaptation of that modern, what we call, like properly also improperly, modern and traditional elements that would make the Prussian army the one it were based, of course, on this fait accompli that the Napoleonic era had caused, that the Restoration couldn't but just belate overall, and that I also pronounce myself. There is a video about say modern tradition, something I don't remember how it goes by the title, but I analyzed there, say, the perplexities of people in general, because there are good and bad sides to, again, people think modernity, sometimes it's completely wrong. The problem is that it's ourselves. I mean, it's the fact that we call modernity something and we label it. We cannot discern what's the functional and traditionally compatible, and if not openly traditional, element to it that works, and what it's just the adaptation, in fact, to sometimes the scale of power. So actually, in traditional guys, what you're really looking for, and some other, say, especially moral implications that are definitely deteriorate if you do not keep up with the standards of human beings, which is the single most important issue overall, right? But in that sense, France didn't have much time to think of that while it was being besieged by basically all the rest of Europe, who was also otherwise to be invaded, as Napoleon proved from the other side. So everybody had to step up to this new scale of warfare that entailed the regular mobilizations of armies of hundreds of thousands that were at this point to be handled in a very different way, in the way it had been before. See, modern warfare had evolved pretty rapidly, after all, during the 18th century. The 17th century battle was based on attrition, fundamentally, like destroying as many enemy forces as possible, but while being very conservative with your own, because at the end of the day, that punching effect, both in terms of, say, political compaction, also logistical capabilities, they were all one, because it entails concentration of resources and a unit of command, was quite feeble in comparison to the later times. With Frederick the Great, we definitely arrived to what is Napoleon's concept also to of warfare, that is the idea that the main objective is to destroy the will of the enemy, and the French Revolution brought this from the battlefield, where, of course, already it always has strategical implications. Ask the Prussians about the miracles of the House of Brandenburg. To a probably totalizing effect of some sort. That is, if you crush, right, if you manage to attract basically all the majority of enemy forces, the strongest part of it, right? It's not literally the Schwerpunkt as such, which is a more sophisticated concept per se, but mostly it also identified with these forces, also because European armies were practically identical, right, at least in terms of conventional warfare in the old continent battlefields. You can literally knock out an entire country of empire in a single engagement, and so there is actually a fast-forwarded strategic capacity, because the ultimate objective on how to fight a war is not to delay it, right? The Von Krieg begins with that beautiful phrase that says, whoever thinks that war can be a bit less bloody, just know that you're making a favor to a much needless and greater amount of destruction than what a swift, quick war will played can, like with that strategic quality and insight, right? Get rid of the problem immediately, right? So whatever drags on, and also, like, of course, it's going to be very costly if there is no evident, let's say, closeness in terms of the strategic balance shifts and so on. So Napoleonic warfare, and I made a bit about the probably Napoleon's contribution to the art of war, was dramatically speeding up, together with the army's movement, probably the strategic aim and point. I mean, armies in the world had never been able to knock each other out and each other's, say, political will out so fast and to such a large scale like it happened at that point. But just think that we, of course, leave after that, but up to that point had literally never seen. So we should be amazed looking at, like as von Clausewitz was, as any observer of Napoleonic warfare, of the peak, right? The largest amount of, say, dimensional engagement and consequences, both from a military and political point of view, that with the social implications, of course, of the same involved. So the logistical implications to move these armies passed through the centralization of power, with the Code Napoleon meaningfully issued just a bit before the most glorious campaign of Austerlitz, on which I made a series, the War of the Third Coalition. The concept was that that the state became the sole source of law. So differently, that's what civil law, and so not just by abolition of a sovereign, like a bit like what civil law meant in Roman imperial terms, but of the state. In that sense, also you can read Napoleon's much different, but still in a fashion that, as I was saying before, would necessarily have to be let's say, to be appreciated, because in terms of consequences of unity of command, that is in fact a major civilizational quality, right? You can be pissed off that this happened through such an anti-traditional concept, like what most say at the root of Napoleonic power, at least in a juridical institutional point of view, that stemming from the French Revolution really was about. But it was also some of that to, say, as a sacrifice to enable a power like France and others to obtain an unprecedented amount of knocking force that could be used in theory, at least if things had worked in a more conscientious way to reflect on the value of tradition, etc. So you can achieve that level of political unity also in an ideal world in which everybody has a single will because it's such a brave people and whatever. And just to to disappoint you a bit, just know that historically that never existed, and that actually civilization progressed, crushing the resistances fundamentally of mobsters who just wanted to continue to create actually their own little tyranny under the claim of alleged freedom, which is also bullshit, considering that liberty is an actual value. In order to master freedom, you should be God in tradition, right? Because you would be completely and absolutely unhinged, and that's also what the core of the Clausewitzian concept of absolute war fundamentally is. It would be a metaphysical one. It was just like a complete coming back to the one in a universe that wouldn't need to fight even any war, because it would recognize the order thing, and that's it. Humans are fallen, and as such they must be schooled in what it means to have a basic human dignity, and this also passes through a healthy dose of violence, and that's exactly what the conscription, the coercion that we assist throughout, in fact, history to move somebody's asses to actually make things work civilizationally gets down to. You will forgive my picturesque language, but it's difficult to teach history, say military history in general, even more strategic culture. But you must start from the basics, and other philosophies, frankly, do not help very much, or they could, but they would be the same philosophy, just with a more refined speech that I cannot afford because I don't use a prepared one aside from my sketches here. But as I was saying, the level of centralization that was needed to move ever larger armies was functional, among the other things, just training, but also to logistics. And so exactly on how to make these armies move, right? You need a hell of a collective training to orderly move all these peoples and all these people and making them, say, functional, militarily speaking, to perform these maneuvers orderly in time, etc. And you know that a great deal of the Napoleonic era sees major strategic accomplishments exactly on this base, and mostly, in fact, on the spring of this sort of was the French military standard. So the coupling of the great French military culture was definitely the most advanced, terrestrially speaking, and the level again of iron fist that the French revolutionary state had also perfection over time under the empire, and bringing to the Grognard, taking over practically almost all of Europe, and still as an accomplishment that basically had never been seen since the times of Charlemagne, or even before, telling the truth. Well, there are different times, of course, and different challenges, but the other Europeans are just not sitting there, right, waiting for this. But there is something to fix, which is, of course, in the mental, in the mindset in general, and in the deep political and social implications that this extension, essentially, of the levy, so arming large masses of people, really means for ancien regimes that are basically just, in some cases, wavering, if not in front of this option, because they had, after all, a tight control on the population, at least not against the French armies that now are threatening their very independence. So movement is definitely that aspect of Napoleonic warfare where you can notice how effective such innovations practically were, right? And you can see throughout Napoleonic warfare, we'll see it hopefully in other videos, how this system kept increasing, right? And how much it contributed to victory. In a broader sense. We understand here that the deeper strategic implications, because, as I was saying before, I didn't finish because of my digressions, but again, if you have, like, basically one of the most core concept of strategy is that you have force, and it's preponderant over the enemy one, the single most intelligent thing that you can do, which naturally costs more force at the moment spent, but it's also more difficult to do technically, but it's really the measure of military quality is punching straight in the face. Like, you don't go around, you don't try to wear out the enemy. If you are superior, just there, smash the hell out of everything that you find in front of you. Naturally, this is the metaphysical concept von Clausewitz explains this. Then he also tells us that given that war is never absolute by definition, we live in the real world, so everything gets declined and say stretched over, in fact, these enormous spaces that all have obstacles, that have enemies that can exploit the latter, etc. And so this movement is not easy, right? It's like warfare. It turns into an art that can be learned, however, more effectively by those armies that more continuously do this on a regular basis with that higher degree of quality, discipline, military valor in general. I mean, this is true for, like, it's the strategic speed is the one we recognize to the Romans. to the Carolingians, to all the great armies, that the Mongols, etc., that were in fact also the most successful in absolute terms for their times, and that we definitely identify in the Napoleonic ones too, right? At least in a system here that become. When I say Napoleonic, I refer to the entire era, right? So the fact that in the sense, if I talk about Napoleonic armies, I refer to all those armies that adopted more or less the French centralizing model, in a way or another, remaining ancien regimes or not, etc. Right, so those armies that objectively were the only ones who could oppose the Napoleon's ones in the first place, right? With lots of complications, the various coalitions, the problems in that sense of coordination. We've seen them in the video about the Austerlitz campaign, etc. Now, Napoleon's soldiers said that the emperor won campaigns with their legs rather than with their bayonets, and in a sense it really was, right? If you manage to project in time enough force somewhere, you can have a critical mass that, aside from the quality of the troops, that in a sense has to be qualitative as well, in order to perform this maneuver and still be able to orderly perform all the various of fighting in the first place, right? That is a challenge after very long marches, and in fact some of these are some of the most famous. The middle of the march through the Black Forest. I don't know. This some occasions, like the French troops were documented like sleeping on the march, just for how vital it was. Made them effectively understood this effort to be, because at the end of the day, if you do not pay, it's like investing in something, right? The more you invest in something, hard work, etc., the least you will have to pay later. So they were buying time because they knew that this was crucial to catch the enemy unprepared, and by surprise, with all the devastating moral effects that this really entailed, right? In many ways, I made a video, I think, not yet about Napoleonic battle per se, but we've seen from Clausewitz how, in spite of course, the strategy being so fast, tactics was very attritional, right? It was probably a given. It was, in part, even a geometrical principle, like Jomini's ones, right? Working in theory, right? As far as, I don't know, knowing, for example, how long does a division take to be worn out, exhausted, if not destroyed, right? So to allow other, like the arrival of other troops on the scene, the reinforcement, the reserves kicking in, and all this stuff. So there is a very carefully balanced way to handle this enormous amount of men, which pertains also to other, say, aspects of this art of war. But planning, it was evident that planning a campaign now meant gathering the various army corps in different areas and even distant from each other, right? And organizing their march in such a way that the enemy would struggle also to understand from which direction the threat would come, while always keeping in a position to gather the majority of the army in the decisive place in the shortest possible time, so as to force the enemy to accept battle if in an unfavorable situation for him. These aspects are crucial in many ways, because if you have basic knowledge of Napoleonic warfare, you know that say the campaigns took place basically all across the continent, right? And so you have this different army corps scattered of course on a line, that was to sweep eventually and ideally any resistance whenever this that would occur in this wider area, because the point was not just concentrating this army corps at a given moment, but also checking possible movements from other nations, other directions, because that's vast and complex the theater really was, even in the secondary fronts. And you know that much of also Napoleonic warfare criticism does pass through this. What about this army corps had been employed there, had been commanded by this other general, etc.? Like, there are some, we've seen it already on some occasion. And we're talking about several hundreds of kilometers of distance sometimes from one another, right? But still with an impressive marching capacity, which is probably one of the single most overlooked aspects in military history in general, right? The speed of armies was always pretty great in line of principle, right? The point was protracting this over a theater that where you wouldn't have the actual logistic points, but say an army even crossing, I don't know, from Portugal to Vladivostok would take an incredibly few time if they were constantly supplied in any era, right? And the point is, in part, exactly that. Strategy became much deeper thanks to this, because, as you understand, that's, say, tactics leaves the place to strategy. They're all intertwined, right? But strategy leaves the place to politics, and politics is also determined by many factors. So, as we were saying before, the participation of some countries or not, that's something that's not military in nature, right? It's military in the moment in which they put on the table their own forces and how they start employing them strategically. But in many ways, there are difficulties also in reconnaissance, in intelligence, because you may never exactly know where all those forces can be moved if they're concentrated somewhere. Like in the case, again, I like the War of the Third Coalition for obvious reasons, and whether the troops of Boulogne that were, conceived to invade Britain were to be moved in the hearts of Central Europe to won one of the most decisive victories in a very remote place in Moravia. Like it's not really a matter of it's difficult. There is a fascinating. Of course, war is unpredictable, but just thinking of the geography of it, where does strategy bring in terms of even some battle locations that you wouldn't have ever heard in history or known of, right? Places like Bouvines or there's literally nothing. so it's the case of Austerlitz or many other famous names, but still, right? They are the product of this much bigger titanic movement of forces that can shift that easily and will eventually unleash its full potential and spend itself in that given point. And as we were saying before, it has to be as bloody as possible, hopefully for the enemy, but that's literally it, right? Virtually, say, defeating an enemy army doesn't pass necessarily through its physical annihilation, but virtually it does, right? Because we're talking, at the end of the day, throughout military history, about forces that were at least competent and motivated to stand together and to go fight somewhere, right? So at the end of the day, it does turn out to be a matter of meat grinder, right? But as I was saying, this let's say the plans, right, of this army's deployments naturally were a matter of somehow of great secrecy, but they took an enormous moral force and very specific qualities psychologically from the side of the command to even just think and decide about this various movements. That's what makes also Napoleon's figure so enormous as a case of megalopsyche. I mean, just having this unspeakable moral burden that any of these strategic moves really take, just being able to switch according to iron logic dictated by practice, because Napoleon didn't leave us with some theoretical insight aside from what we can draw from his, in fact, accomplishments speaking for it. He was just capable of handling that with a single mind surely makes it one of the greatest in its time, to say the least, right? And this was a game of possibilities, of, if you want, not such enormous ones, because say the greater the strategic dimension, the less options are available, but also the greater effort in terms of the most advantageous one, and the greater the risk according is entailed. As we were saying before, dancing around doesn't bring you much elsewhere. That means to leave the initiative to the enemy, and it's strategically detrimental in so many ways. And not just like that. I mean, also from a political or moral point of view, it's really something that you do not want to be in. And in all this, you understand why time was so important, because if you had armies that had dramatic speed, like over the others, that had the training, the command, the logistics, etc., capable of making them move as smoothly as possible, you could win a great amount of time to be earned day after day, but still for this very long marches that could really make the big difference, right? As we've seen again in the World of the Third Coalition, there's the story going around that, you know, the Russians had a different calendar from the West, and so they wouldn't, date exactly, in the same way, and they had problems of coordination. This is actually a myth, but the actual problems in that regard were not less than if it had been the case. I mean, just think about the connections of Central and Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. It was something pretty tormented, about them, and just the enormous, again, organizational problems more than else, right? It's not much again, everything that pertains to the land just per se, as we've seen in the Fangkrieg, also the weather per se, it's the least of problems, actually. The greatest one, the most complex system, even just mathematically speaking, is putting that freaking large amount of troops together, right? Naturally, as we were just saying, these forces would be initially separated because, first of all, it made it easier to handle. They didn't come all through the same route, so it would be easier just to supply them, right? Getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen, that's the point. And of course, in fact, would allow to group them at the right moment, at the right place, where, however, you had to speed up things dramatically. It would have been at the climatic battle location, usually. And so you could even, again, there are some cases like the one of Austerlitz that I decided to take an example for this video, where the same, let's say, the same attitude of two armies facing each other could be scoped to give enough time to reinforcements arriving from tens of kilometers away, as it would happen exactly during the battle. Again, all this were calculated in a chronometrical way, right? To just give the impression to the enemy that you had, for example, less forces on the field, and that was it, while you actually had lots in reserve. But still, were garrisoning, like in that case from the French side, some places that you had just conquered recently that in theory had potential, some of course always could be, were exposed, were being worn out, right? Because in all this you don't have, even in the most optimal logistical conditions, the certainty that even just a standard stable force just remaining standing as such, right? At some point, troops have to be, to winter somewhere. They have to go into certain camps. You must provide for them, etc. And just making them stand in a campaign means to see them being worn out. Consider that the mass levies entailed also higher rates of desertion, and so higher levels of degradation, right? Not that in previous times they had not been relatively as important at that point, but of course the bigger system degenerates faster, it's not kept alive by an adequate force. It must be greater. So that's really what, as you understand, starts surpassing so many boundaries that were typical of the previous centuries. Also, just from a political point of view, which kind of power could do this, right? I made videos about the army of Louis XIV. I mean, it was from only very recently the modern armies as we intend them had been born. So also a very strongly accelerated development that makes you question even more if it weren't just such a horrid thing in itself, with the concept of the military revolution, as if whatever happened from the end of the Middle Ages to the early modern age was something even remotely comparable to what happened exactly where allegedly the end of the military revolution begins from. So again, you would be surprised by the level of complete carelessness, even within environments, say, that are supposed to inform or educate or whatever, and that instead leave us with this kind of dramatic, desolations, morally speaking. So, of course, all this machine would have not worked without the decisive advances made also in the most different fields of civilization. One, for example, in cartography, which is, I think, an underappreciated branch. Maybe it's just because I'm a bit fixated with maps ever since I'm a child, but cartography was dramatically speeding up, as you know, through many means, including aerostatic balloons and something like that, but mostly the capacity of states now to control territorially much better, having much more means, more centralized system, having just more advanced mathematical, statistical branches, and so on. Think about the cadastre, the great ones of Maria Theresia, also the Prussians, and many other countries. So you can imagine with colonialism, Britain, France leading the path, this kind of more global awareness, right? So the Ancien regime actually has enormous merits, as you can expect, because most of what we see there was, as a civilization, even in Napoleonic times, was based on a sound ground of what had been accomplished by the states before. It had opened the way to this further development. One of the consequences was the generals now having complete maps of the road network, which did not exist previously. Right? The history of cartography is quite fascinating in this regard, because you realize how it all began. It was mostly the naval powers, right? The ancient and medieval portolani. That before, like that, there were, like in Roman times, the so-called itineraria. Basically, all you needed to know was how to get from point A to point B, and then from there, whether you were interested or not, how to get to point C. It was a sort of description of what you would find along the road. Then from the late Middle Ages, you start having mostly the naval powers tracing in incredible detail, actually. We're talking about the Italians, the Catalans, right? These people, the coastlines, right? Mostly of the Mediterranean. And maybe they knew much less because they had much less means to measure, say, the extent of Central Europe, for example. But then this would gradually expand, and legitimately, it was very difficult just to have, in general, the possibility of knowing from, say, France, what kind of paths existed, say, in Romania, like in the possibility of operating as Suvorov at some point would have liked, like drawing the French army in the east at some point and wearing it out there, to use like this, and connecting this cartographical knowledge to the capacity of declining such information with the actual unit's deployment, which evidently was an art left to the single officers, etc. Right. So the general staffs could now plan more complex movements with a machine that, also from the bottom up, was drilled in ways that are also relatively lesser known in military history. Like it's normal. Like we mostly know warfare from the bigger events in the higher echelons, right? And then about how the NCOs or the troop really carried things out is less known in practice, and which less degree of precision, also for reasons, say, gnosiological and heuristic reasons that we cannot simply digress on, but as you can easily imagine. The important is the thing to work, right? And so the bigger and most important things are definitely the ones taken at the top. And the elite definitely is always the most gifted part of any civilization, against any myth of the butchers or the terrible heads of states that drive the poor innocent people towards all the poor innocent people, except they are exactly the same ones over which, and the Napoleonic era and the Clausewitzian theory brilliantly exemplifiers, of course, at the most emotional, irrational evil, like brutal element of the entire the Clausewitzian trinity, that you also need for fighting a war, right? Which is not just to, it's a really serious thing, but only combined civilization with the other elements, and not just as if the people alone were, and especially from an individual point of view, something we should take too much care of in consideration. Let's put it this way. So this went in parallel with a series of movements, maneuvers, as a single body of forces, apparently, however, scattered before reuniting over a vast theater of operations. So everything had to be regulated with extreme care, not because who was at the top, in fact, had to micromanage all this elements, but in order to make this elements alone all more compact, uniform, supplied, etc., as to count on them, right? Aside from, of course, all the accidents of war, and of course, first of all, the enemy opposition, right, that can screw things up pretty easily. This was also, as we were pointing out before, the only way to keep such large armies in the field in the first place, right? At least without depleting the territory's resources too soon. This is one of the most incredible aspects of this all, is that basically the say logistical trains at this point were eliminated. You'd think that, like, if you'd never considered the aspect, the larger the armies in history, and so there is a sort of linear development, right? This is not the case, right? The logistical trains had been very important throughout all the modern era. They had essentially increased in importance in the 18th century because armies were ever heavier. Also, artillery was increasing in power. We'll make other videos on that. So, also in numbers, just of pieces and so on. So the most important strategy, to a degree, was also trying to cut off the enemy supply lines, because there literally was like a train, a route through which the supplies passed continuously, and if you wanted to make the armies keep working, you had to preserve their flanks, right, etc. In Napoleonic times, this thing stops to a degree, right? There are some elements cannot be replaced immediately. In fact, the aforementioned artillery, horses, but like some horses, depending on like the availability of your homeland mostly, but the larger amount of logistical needs, so literally what troops have to eat, so hundreds of thousands, let's remember that, along the way, basically doesn't have a logistical train. Everything is consumed on the spot, and as a consequence, the armies must move very fast because they literally cannot remain more than a couple of days in in the average European countryside spot, at the risk of literally starving to death and or crippling effects that prelude, in any case, to that. The consequences are also this increased speed, right? It all becomes more of a sort of gamble. You understand that? Because as we were saying before, the more the strategic aim increases, and first of all, notoriously, the more the odds get balanced. Because again, when you have the greater concentration of forces, the enemy is just pushed automatically to do the same, and so it's actually in the smaller engagements that things can go more easily, like, I don't know, one unit destroying, I don't know, 10 times larger force. It happens all the time, say, as an exception still, but this is much more difficult to do, also because there is much less surprise in the first place, and the enemy will join forces at that point in the same way. But that's properly the reason of it all. You want this crushing amount, this crushing mass of people to face as quickly as possible what cannot be otherwise get past, right? As we were saying before, like, say, all the powers involved here didn't have a conservative purpose. They were either like France trying to conquer the rest of Europe, of the rest of Europe trying to conquer France. So it was always this game of back and forth, an iron arm, and again, given that you had to do it on a political basis, once you did it, had to be either like this or like succumbing, especially to the larger numbers of the opponents. France, doesn't matter how much of a demographic giant it was, it has still to contend with pretty large counter, like the largest was actually Russia, but exactly for that reason, it had to defeat the enemy on time. So on the speed of the armies, of the concentration of forces, it wasn't just that, right? Again, numbers are very important in this mechanism. Von Clausewitz also describes fundamentally the necessity of the famous 1 to 3, like looking at the larger battles, campaigns of the Napoleonic era, to say, like, beyond that, you can say that it's not reasonable just to fight if you're inferior to it. I mean, and so even relatively, France had the highest quality, but still some pretty large amounts of troops could put in trouble the French, that were ultimately defeated, and still maintaining their country though. And so that there is like, we always swing between political and military considerations, but that in fact what von Clausewitz means with war as a continuation of politics with other means. In any case, this mechanism of going as fast across Europe and not even thinking about creating a massive intercontinental logistical train was obviously the most profitable way of war. Hundreds of thousands of men could not be gathered in a single area without soon being faced with insurmountable problems of housing, drinking water, firewood, fodder for the horses. The larger the army, the more you're going to feel even like temperature changes and so on. So everything becomes ever more attritional the bigger you are. So that's why the speed is also crucial among the other things. So the secret consisted in making them march through areas that were even very distant from each other, exploiting the road network to make them converge in the same place, only at the moment of the decisive battle. And this would temporarily mask also the strategic goal, because you could know that the enemy was marching, but you would have difficulty even picturing how many and where this force is located, which you couldn't quite know until the last, which could really also change things on the battlefield, of course. Now, in the summer of 1812, Napoleon entered Russia with 500,000 men, covering a front of 400 kilometers, and yet all marching as part of a single organism. Right? Think about, more than a century later, 163 divisions of somebody else, like entering the Soviet Union. So consider, like, even how close in time this stuff is. I mean, how fast this development, right, passing through at least the French Revolution, etc., was bringing to much more familiar scale of strategic involvement, right? So the main objective in 1812 was bringing the majority of these forces to battle on a specific day with the Russian army, right? Which is what defeated the French, not winter, by the way. That didn't help, but it's not that the Russians were particularly happy of that either, right? Were just favored in a different way. But to make you understand again the importance of numbers, there aren't some mysterious forces like connected to one element or another, even weather, that can make you hope to contend with 500,000 men just per se, right? People have a severe problem normally with the concept of what is decisive or not, right? Very often they pick, usually the technological factors and how much can it count in the 50-50, like 1%, 2%, to be generous, and saying, look, well, since without that it would have not made 51%, it's the decisive thing. What about all the other 49%? Like, that doesn't count, that is not decisive in of itself, that doesn't crush alone, that minimal factor. But of course, we have specifically uneducated people to be ever more stupid, so this elementary concept seems extremely difficult for the average commoner to even approach, and so they have literally to think, I don't know, World War I was fought for 4 years in a row on the Western Front in that way because of shells and machine guns. I mean, they actually believed that, right? And again, if you're still there and you find some like that, it's actually a sensible thing, I would check seriously the historical background and probably something more. Because this is not acceptable in 2023 anymore, at least from adult people who actually can vote, make children, drive cars, right? This is a major global tragedy that we should eradicate pretty quickly in order to at least save our poor civilization to this point. The marches are war, argued Napoleon, and the principle according to which the secret of victory consists in gathering numerically superior forces where the enemy does not expect it, and more quickly than it can foresee, has remained until today one of the cornerstones of the art of war. Naturally, it was not invented by Napoleon. It existed since the dawn of warfare, so there is really nothing revolutionary about that. But Napoleon, as you know, impressed us in a somehow iconic way, and until World War I, of course, how much properly this legacy of grandeur was collected in the also the concept that war had essentially be a war of that degree of movement. That up to a certain point was actually a sensible thing to do. I mean, even in the aforementioned World War I, the Eastern Front was very mobile. The Middle Eastern one as well. So even if things change, they change for the nature of states. They do not change for technology per se. And you never fight in the same way in the same places, right? definitely movement has to do with the absolute idea of war per se, right? Maneuvering is basically the point that you have the initiative in the first place, and that even if the enemy is doing the same, you somehow have a room for itself, and you must exploit it. So there is a quite seductive concept behind the idea in itself. Naturally, you have to evaluate it on the basis of how much this is feasible, what is that you're doing on the field, how and why. So it's not just a preferential choice that you can't simply enact whenever you want, right? Sometimes you have to stay pretty still and concentrating, especially in that case, in the advances that the advantages that defense can offer, while operating on other lines, right, to maybe outflank, to attract the enemy in a trap or something like that. And it is important to stress here how much this strategic compaction didn't leave you in the decisive moment. In fact, other choices per se, right? There are not so many things that you can do with these armies once you have, for example, entered an enemy territory. We've seen it in the Fangkrieg, right? You basically have to go across again this hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, and basically you have to create, even logistically, this sort of warm, extending, say that you leave behind, trying to of course, to garrison it, wearing out part of your own forces along the way, because it is going to be preferentially the one through which you have to retreat, to withdraw if things really go wrong. And this is quite interesting, because you'd say, well, but somebody could simply cut the retreat at that point. Well, try to do it when you have hundreds of thousands of men that are invading your territory. At that point, you will be yourself committed to that, to the defense, rather than thinking how to cut the supply lines, because you will have of the enemy, because at that point it's imperative to concentrate as many forces in defense as well. And of course you can harass this enemy lines, etc., but it's never going to be as decisive as the punch that you can deliver, hopefully, with your own concentrated forces somewhere else. So this observing military history and how wars were fought throughout the years, of course, gives you a pretty decent understanding of how much is universal and how much is contingent, which are both true at the same time. The fact that war ever changes, that nothing is really the same, are perfectly coherent with one another. That's yet another double threat level of understanding that seemingly the broader audience has a difficulty with handling. Now, convinced that speed of movement was essential, Napoleon sought to free his armies as much as possible from the slavery of depot and convoys, as we were pointing out. The former were still quite crucial. In many ways, of course, this process of invasion meant to garrison some fortresses. There is a bit of the death of fortresses in this time in warfare. Not completely, but of course, the larger the army, the least important defensive positions, say punctiform defensive positions, really become. Of course, every fortress is part of a broader net of defense that at the end of the day works because there is an army capable of backing it. Like fortresses alone do not work, right? You have to mend them, you have to defend them, etc. So we've seen this in the Fangkrieg as well. We will have to recover resume that series, because it's really telling of how it was done materially, right? So it's really eye-opening in many ways, mind-opening to say the least. And of course, in the wars of the Ancien Regime, instead, this defense systems, as much as logistics, limited movement so much, right? As we were saying before, in the old regime, the point was having sort of, say, armies had been growing consistently, but they somehow were still sort of possessions of a monarchy, of a dynasty that practiced a sort of aristocratic sport that war really was, and the idea of arming vast amounts of troops was not, first of all, it had never been tried, but it was politically subversive in many ways. So they preferred to invest in quality, and so having this specifically heavier armies that you really needed to supply continuously. Also, because being smaller, they stumbled much more easily on fortresses, etc. So they had, in part, the same problem that the Napoleonic ones really had, like most armies in general from antiquity. Like that, if you stay too long in a place, bad things start happening. Right? You need ever more resources. They're going to be ever more far away, and hygienic conditions are rapidly deteriorating. And more, and generally speaking, as we've seen in a greater universe, in a greater strategic sense, idling unless you're not defending with some advantage even in supplies and so on, it's not a great thing in the first place. So, as we were saying before, it's not that these systems disappeared entirely in Napoleonic warfare. Indeed, the preparation of a campaign still did involve, and on an even greater scale, actually, in absolute terms, the setting up of immense warehouses of provisions, ammunition, clothing, and shoes. You understand that point, right? But Napoleon wanted his armies to be able to live and fight without depending on supply convoys on a daily basis. And he put back into use the ancient practice, which the civilized civilized in brackets. Yes, it was a hell of a civilization, but not for this only. 18th century had tried to limit, whereby soldiers fed themselves by requisitioning everything they needed on the spot. The war thus once again became a frighteningly destructive scourge, right, for civilian populations, like in the direct sense, right? It's not just that there were some contractors letting troops and coercing them, forcing them, pressing them into military service, but even though, say, the atrocities against the civilian population no longer reached the usual levels in the 16th and 17th centuries, the passage of an army again began to leave poverty and destruction in its wake, for obvious reasons. You would have to hope that this would not be for long. But the pace of military operations, in fact, was greatly accelerated just per se. So everything was balanced to a greater level of destruction whenever you needed to destroy something. That, I think, is particularly obvious. I mean, some cities entirely were destroyed at some point. It's true that the world had civilized in the sense that among Europeans, say, savagery, like simple, like Napoleon was quite strict about this. Like, he punished, he shot, like most commanders also in previous centuries. He wouldn't tolerate any act of insubordination if we said, like, particularly spare territory or to just behave in a certain way, not committing other crimes, rape, all these things. He was very much in tune with what was understood to be the normal practice of warfare of the time. But warfare just per se was destructive as a whole, and it would entail the movements, the refugees, just the destruction, the consumption of resources that were evidently sacrificed for reasons of major force. So it is difficult to sometimes even picture the scale of destruction, sufferance, and pain that the Napoleonic Wars brought. But just know that these were fought, because evidently something in Europe was changing, and it was not just an anomaly popped out from somewhere that was bringing things to an end or changing the world as a whole, right? The things always change, and one has to understand why they changed the way they did, and how much responsibility there is, not for someone to do something, but for the others just to let that happen, or to lose even against that. So it's surely after Napoleonic, the Napoleonic era, nothing would be the same as always, but this time in a deeper sense than others. Many others had been happening before. A French corps could travel up to 30 kilometers a day, a speed which until the last minute continued to cause panic and consternation among the adversaries. I mean, it was not the individual force per se, but the fact that these and the individual speed, but the fact that all the elements of the machine worked. Right, that was the most important thing. The speed was the same, like the past armies. Right, it's just that these would handle war in a different way. That required also, that could afford even slower speed. This was not entirely the point, just per se. Again, speeds in warfare have always been practically the same in any time, in any age. But the problem is that war, as just given the scale forces involved, had become much more mobile and dynamic, and so this required, in order to be coped with an unprecedented level of regulation of forces, in fact thrown in, that had never been seen used all together, which is what stimulates like the means through which, like the development of the means through which you can control, regulate this. This is particularly important and cannot be simply, let's say, okay, well, this is not important. This is what essentially Napoleonic warfare got down to in practice, right? And of course, together with all the rest, declining it. But let's say that we will see this stuff in on other occasions. We will talk about Napoleonic warfare surely soon. At some point, there is still a lot to discuss. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.